The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base, casting harsh shadows across the faces of 12 seasoned pilots. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a blood-orange dawn, while inside, the air thick with testosterone and jet fuel cologne, nobody paid attention to the woman refilling coffee cups along the back wall. She moved with practiced invisibility, her movements economical and precise, auburn hair pulled back in regulation fashion. To the assembled aviators, she was furniture, background noise and olive-drab fatigues. Captain Jake Viper Morrison leaned back in his metal folding chair, regaling his squadron mates with another war story from his recent deployment over Syria. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, hands gesturing dramatically as he described a particularly harrowing close air support mission. The other pilots nodded appreciatively, some chuckling at his more colorful descriptions of enemy positions being turned into parking lots. But Viper's story died mid-sentence when his peripheral vision caught something that made his blood freeze. The coffee woman had turned slightly, reaching for an empty pot, and there on her right sleeve, partially concealed beneath her rolled cuff, was a patch he'd only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of military aviation. A small, seemingly innocuous emblem, a black phoenix rising from silver flames, surrounded by 13 stars. Below it, barely visible, were the words Night Ravens. The room continued its casual chatter, but Viper's world had gone silent. His mouth hung slightly open as memories flooded back, stories his instructor at Top Gun had told him in hushed tones about a classified squadron that operated in shadows so deep, officially, they didn't exist. Stories about impossible missions completed by pilots whose names were scrubbed from all records, whose achievements would never see daylight, whose very existence was denied by three-letter agencies. The woman caught his stare and their eyes met across the room. Hers were the color of storm clouds, calm but holding depths that spoke of things seen and done in places that didn't appear on any map. For just a moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or maybe warning. Then she looked away, continuing her mundane task as if nothing had happened. But Viper knew better. He just locked eyes with a ghost. The briefing officer entered, calling the room to attention, but Viper's mind was elsewhere, trying to process what he'd just seen. The Night Raven's patch meant only one thing. Whoever this woman was, she'd flown missions that made his Syria deployment look like a training exercise. And now she was serving coffee to a bunch of peacetime pilots who had no idea they were in the presence of someone who'd probably saved their country multiple times over. As she quietly exited through the back door, Viper found himself wondering what sequence of events had brought a Night Raven to this moment, invisible among them, carrying secrets in silence. The greatest mystery wasn't what she'd done. It was why she was here, pretending to be ordinary when she was clearly anything but. The morning briefing continued around him, but Captain Jake Morrison was no longer listening. His world had just gotten infinitely more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Because in his experience, ghosts didn't serve coffee unless they had a very good reason for haunting the living. Lieutenant Colonel Raven Phantom Blackthorne had been invisible for so long that sometimes she forgot she existed at all. 3 years since her last classified mission, 2 years since the Night Raven squadron had been officially dissolved and scattered to the winds, and 18 months since she'd been quietly reassigned to administrative duties at Nellis. The transition from flying black operations over hostile territory to managing supply inventories, and apparently, coffee service had been jarring enough to break lesser people. But Raven wasn't lesser people. She'd earned her call sign not for any mystical qualities, but because of her uncanny ability to appear and disappear in enemy airspace like smoke. Phantom had been her secondary call sign, the one used in radio chatter when even Raven was too identifiable for the mission parameters. Now both names felt like relics from another life, gathering dust in some classified filing cabinet she'd never see again. The morning sun slanted through her small apartment window as she changed out of her BDUs and into civilian clothes for her weekend off. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman just past 30, physically unremarkable except for those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much. The night raven's patch lay on her dresser where she'd placed it after that morning's briefing, a calculated risk, wearing it partially visible. She'd needed to know if anyone in that room would recognize what it meant. Only one had. Captain Morrison's reaction had been textbook, the momentary shock, the instant recognition, the way his eyes had tracked her movement afterward. She'd run a background check on him the moment she got back to her desk. Distinguished graduate from the Air Force Academy, Top Gun honors, multiple combat deployments, impeccable service record. More importantly, his instructor had been Colonel Marcus Steele Reynolds, her former squadron leader, and one of only 6 people who knew the full extent of Night Raven's operations. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Unknown number, but the area code made her heart skip. She answered on the second ring. Phantom. The voice on the other end was gravelly, familiar despite 3 years of silence. Steele. She kept her voice level, professional, even as her pulse quickened. I thought you were enjoying retirement in Montana. Retirement's overrated. We need to talk. About what? About why a certain captain at your base has been asking very specific questions about Night Raven's patches. About why satellite imagery shows unusual aircraft movements at a facility that officially doesn't exist. And about why you might want to dust off your flight suit. Raven walked to her window, looking out at the vast expanse of desert that stretched toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, in hardened bunkers and climate-controlled hangars, aircraft waited that could slip through enemy radar like ghosts through walls. Aircraft she'd once known as intimately as her own heartbeat. The Ravens are gone, Steele. Command made that very clear. The Ravens are gone, but the world still has problems that require Raven solutions. And whether the bureaucrats want to admit it or not, sometimes the only way to fight shadows is with shadows. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of duty settling on her shoulders like an old, comfortable jacket. 3 years of invisibility, of pretending to be ordinary, of serving coffee to pilots who would never know what real flying looked like. 3 years of suffocating silence. Where and when? Tonight, the usual place, and Phantom. His voice carried a note of something she hadn't heard in years. Hope. Bring your wings. The line went dead, and Raven Blackthorn found herself staring at her reflection again. But this time, she saw something different in those storm-gray eyes. Purpose. The usual place was a diner called Rosie's, 20 miles outside Las Vegas on a strip of highway that time had forgotten. Chrome and red vinyl booths, coffee that could strip paint, and a clientele that minded their own business, perfect for conversations that officially never happened. Raven arrived first, choosing a corner booth with clear sightlines to both entrances, old habits dying hard even in civilian clothes. Steele Reynolds walked in exactly on time, and despite 3 years, he looked unchanged, tall, weathered, with silver hair that had earned him his call sign decades before she'd ever climbed into a cockpit. He slid into the booth across from her with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered too many high-G maneuvers and hard landings. You look good, Phantom. Civilian life treating you well. Like a prison sentence with better food. She signaled the waitress for 2 coffees. What's this about, Steele? And don't tell me you came out of retirement just to reminisce about the good old days. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet, placing it face down on the table between them. 3 days ago, a commercial satellite photographed something it shouldn't have been able to see. Want to guess what it was? I'm not in the guessing business anymore. Steele flipped the tablet around. The image showed an aerial view of what appeared to be empty desert, but Raven's trained eye caught the telltale signs immediately. The geometric patterns in the sand, the slight variations in color that indicated recently moved Earth, the access roads that led nowhere according to official maps. Groom Lake, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Not Groom Lake. Somewhere that doesn't have a name because it doesn't exist. But satellite imagery suggests there's been significant activity there in the past 6 months. New construction, aircraft movements, the whole 9 yards. And this concerns me how? Because 2 weeks ago, a night raven's patch appeared on the black market in Prague. Yesterday, another one surfaced in Beirut. And this morning, Captain Morrison at your base submitted a formal inquiry about classified squadron insignia through proper channels. Raven felt something cold settle in her stomach. Night Raven's patches weren't supposed to exist anywhere except in the personal collections of the 8 pilots who'd worn them. 7 now, since Vega had been killed over Pakistan. The fact that they were appearing in the wild meant someone was either incredibly careless or sending a very specific message. You think someone's trying to reconstitute the program. I think someone's already reconstituted the program. The question is whether it's us or them. The waitress brought their coffee, and they sat in silence until she was gone. Outside, trucks rumbled past on their way to nowhere in particular, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. What do you need from me, Steele? I need you to do what you do best. Be invisible. Get close to this Captain Morrison. Find out what he knows and who he's been talking to. Then I need you to take a little unauthorized flight to see what's really happening at our mystery facility. I haven't been in a cockpit in 2 years. You don't forget how to fly any more than you forget how to breathe. Besides, I have something that might interest you. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a set of wings. Not regulation Air Force wings, but something else entirely. Black metal with silver highlights, depicting a raven in flight with its wings spread wide. Raven recognized them immediately. Her original Night Raven's wings, the ones she'd turned in when the squadron was disbanded. The ones that had been locked away in some vault, never to see daylight again. How did you? Let's just say some things are too important to stay buried. Steele pushed the wings across the table. The world's gotten more dangerous since we went dark, Phantom, and dangerous times call for dangerous people. She picked up the wings, feeling their familiar weight. For a moment, she was back in the cockpit of her F-22 Raptor, call sign Phantom, invisible to radar and invincible in the sky. She was 28 years old again, flying missions that would never appear in any history book, saving lives that would never know they'd been saved. Then the moment passed, and she was just Raven Blackthorne again, sitting in a diner with a man who was asking her to disappear once more into the shadows. When do I start? You already have. Captain Jake Morrison couldn't concentrate on anything. 3 days had passed since the briefing room incident, and the image of that Night Raven's patch had burned itself into his retina. He tried the official channels first, a carefully worded inquiry about historical squadron insignia for research purposes, but had received only form letters and bureaucratic non-answers that told him exactly nothing while making it clear he should stop asking. So he'd tried unofficial channels, a few discreet conversations with senior pilots who'd been around longer than him, casual questions about special operations units and black projects. Each inquiry had been met with the same response, polite deflection and a subtle suggestion that some rocks were better left unturned. But Jake Morrison hadn't survived 3 combat deployments and earned his Top Gun wings by leaving rocks unturned. If anything, the official silence only confirmed what he already suspected, that the woman serving coffee in the briefing room was someone significant, someone whose very existence was a carefully guarded secret. He found her by accident on Thursday afternoon, walking across the base toward the motor pool. She moved differently than the other support personnel, with the confident stride of someone comfortable in their own skin. Without thinking, he altered his course to intersect with hers. "Excuse me," he called out when he was close enough. She turned, and once again he found himself looking into those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Captain Morrison. Her voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of something that might have been amusement. Something I can help you with. I was hoping we could talk about your background. My background is serving coffee and managing supply inventories. Not much to discuss there. That's not what I meant, and I think you know it. For a moment, she studied him with the intensity of a pilot evaluating a potential threat. Then something in her expression shifted, just slightly. Walk with me, Captain. They moved across the base in companionable silence, passing rows of F-16s and F-35s lined up on the flight line like sleeping predators. The afternoon sun was brutal, but neither of them seemed to notice. Finally, when they were well away from any buildings or potential eavesdroppers, she spoke. What exactly do you think you saw in that briefing room? A patch that's not supposed to exist on the sleeve of someone who's not supposed to exist. And what are you planning to do with that information? Jake had been dreading this question because he honestly didn't know the answer. I'm not sure, but my instructor at Top Gun was Colonel Reynolds and he told me stories. Steele Reynolds was your instructor. Her step faltered almost imperceptibly. You know him. I know of him, good pilot, better teacher. She was quiet for several steps. What kind of stories did he tell you? Stories about pilots who flew missions that never happened, against enemies that didn't exist, using aircraft that were never built. Stories about a squadron that saved the world several times over and never got credit for any of it. Those sound like the kinds of stories old pilots tell young pilots to make themselves feel important. Maybe. Or maybe they're the kinds of stories that prepare young pilots for the fact that sometimes the real war isn't the one everyone can see. She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. For a moment, Jake thought he was looking at a different person entirely. Not the quiet supply clerk, but someone harder, more dangerous, infinitely more capable. Captain Morrison, let me give you some advice. There are questions in the military that have answers, and there are questions that have consequences. The trick is learning which ones are which before you ask them. And which kind is this? The kind that might get you exactly what you're looking for. Before he could ask what that meant, she was walking away, leaving him standing alone on the tarmac with more questions than answers. But Jake Morrison was a pilot, and pilots were trained to navigate by the stars even when the sky was dark. Something told him his navigation was about to get a lot more complicated. That night, as he lay in his quarters staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Captain Morrison, this is Colonel Reynolds. I think it's time we had a talk. The phone call from Steele Reynolds had been brief and cryptic. A time, a place, and a single instruction. Come alone. Now Jake Morrison found himself driving through the Nevada desert at midnight, following directions to coordinates that led him to what appeared to be an abandoned gas station 30 miles from nowhere. But as he pulled up, he could see it wasn't entirely abandoned. Light spilled from the office windows, and a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows, Colonel Reynolds, looking exactly as Jake remembered him from Top Gun, only with more gray in his hair and more lines around his eyes. Captain, thanks for coming. Sir, what's this about, and how does it relate to? To the woman with the interesting patch, everything and nothing depending on how you look at it. Steele gestured toward the office. Come inside, we need to talk. The gas station office had been converted into something resembling a command center. Maps covered one wall, showing regions that Jake recognized from his deployments and several he didn't. A bank of computer monitors displayed what looked like satellite feeds, and a communications array in the corner suggested this place was more connected to the world than its external appearance indicated. Impressive setup for a retired colonel, Jake observed. Retirement is a state of mind, Captain, and right now my mind is very much engaged. Steele moved to one of the maps, pointing to a section of desert marked only with coordinates. What do you know about black projects? only what everyone knows. Classified aircraft development, advanced weapons systems, things that don't officially exist until they're ready to officially exist. That's the sanitized version. The reality is more complicated. Steele turned to face him directly. Sometimes the military develops capabilities that are so sensitive, so potentially destabilizing, that they can never officially exist. Not ever. These projects require special people to operate them, people who can disappear into the shadows and emerge only when the world needs saving. Like the Night Ravens. Like the Night Ravens. 8 pilots, hand-picked from the best of the best flying aircraft that push the boundaries of physics itself. They operated for 7 years, completing missions in places you've never heard of against threats you'd never believe. Jake felt his pulse quicken. What happened to them? Officially, they were disbanded 3 years ago when budget cuts forced the military to consolidate special operations assets. Unofficially, Steele walked to another map, this one showing global hotspots marked with red pins. They went dark, scattered to regular assignments, told to pretend they'd never existed, forced to watch the world become more dangerous without them. And the woman at Nellie's. Call sign Phantom. Real name classified. 73 confirmed missions, 0 failures, 0 casualties among friendlies under her protection. She's the reason Damascus still exists. She's the reason that dirty bomb never went off in Mumbai. She's the reason your deployment to Syria was boring instead of catastrophic. The weight of that revelation settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. He thought about all the times during his deployment when enemy fighters had simply vanished from radar, when SAM sites had mysteriously gone offline, when convoy routes had been inexplicably clear of IEDs. He'd attributed it to good intelligence and lucky timing. She was there during my deployment. She was watching. She was there, Captain Morrison, flying aircraft that don't exist, completing missions that never happened, ensuring that pilots like you could focus on the obvious threats while she handled the ones you'd never see coming. Why are you telling me this? Steele was quiet for a long moment, studying the satellite feeds on his monitors. Finally, he looked back at Jake with an expression that mixed hope and desperate determination. Because the Night Ravens are about to fly again, and we need pilots we can trust to help them. The revelation hit Jake like a brick wall. Everything he thought he knew about his military service, about the nature of modern warfare, about his own role in keeping the world safe, had just been turned upside down. But underneath the shock, he felt something else: excitement. The kind of excitement a pilot feels when offered the chance to fly something faster, higher, and more dangerous than anything they've ever imagined. What do you need me to do? Steele smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. First, you need to understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't Top Gun, Captain. This isn't even normal special operations. This is something else entirely. He walked to a steel cabinet and pulled out a thick folder marked with classifications Jake had never seen before. Read this, all of it, then decide if you're ready to disappear. Steele Reynolds had given Jake Morrison 48 hours to read the classified files and make his decision. The folder contained mission reports, aircraft specifications, and personnel files that painted a picture of warfare unlike anything Jake had ever imagined. The Night Ravens hadn't just been pilots. They'd been surgical instruments of national security, capable of reaching anywhere in the world within hours and neutralizing threats with precision that bordered on the supernatural. But it was the aircraft specifications that truly took his breath away. The primary mount for Night Ravens operations had been a modified F-22 Raptor designated F-22X Ghost, a variant that existed nowhere in official documentation. Enhanced stealth capabilities, extended range, weapon systems that defied conventional understanding of physics, and most remarkably, a propulsion system that allowed for near-silent operation at subsonic speeds. Jake found Raven exactly where he expected to, in the base commissary during the dinner hour, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be official paperwork. But now that he knew what to look for, he could see the tells. The way she positioned herself to watch all entrances, how her eyes tracked every person who entered, the precise economy of her movements that spoke of someone trained to operate in hostile territory. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, approaching her table. She looked up from her paperwork, and for a moment he saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes: evaluation, calculation, decision. "Free country, Captain Morrison. Though I should warn you, I'm not particularly good company." "I think you're probably better company than you let on." He sat down across from her, noting how she subtly shifted her position to maintain clear sightlines. "I had an interesting conversation with Colonel Reynolds. Steele always was a talker. He told me about Damascus and Mumbai and a few other things that officially never happened." Raven set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. When she looked at him again, the facade of the invisible supply clerk was completely gone, replaced by someone Jake instinctively recognized as extremely dangerous. "And what exactly did you think of his stories?" "I think they explain a lot about why my deployment to Syria was remarkably quiet. I think they explain why certain mission reports I filed never received responses. And I think they explain why someone with your obvious qualifications is currently managing coffee supplies." "My obvious qualifications?" "The way you move, the way you watch, the way you position yourself in every room like you're planning an escape route or setting up a defensive position. Plus, there's this." Jake pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph he'd taken discreetly, a close-up of her hands holding the coffee pot. "Most people don't have calluses in those specific locations unless they've spent a lot of time gripping a control stick under high-G loads." For the first time since he'd met her, Raven smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it transformed her face entirely. "You're observant, Captain Morrison. That could be a valuable trait or a dangerous liability, depending on the circumstances. Steele seems to think I might have uses for both." "And what do you think?" Jake had been wrestling with that question for 2 days. Everything in his training, his upbringing, his entire understanding of military service told him to follow proper channels, respect the chain of command, and never volunteer for missions that didn't officially exist. But everything in his gut told him that sometimes the right thing to do and the official thing to do weren't the same thing. "I think the world is more dangerous than most people realize. I think there are threats out there that require solutions most people couldn't handle. And I think sometimes the only way to protect the light is to be willing to work in the darkness." Raven studied him for what felt like forever, and Jake had the unsettling sensation of being X-rayed by someone who could see straight through to his soul. Finally, she nodded, just once. "Steele's putting together a team. Unofficial, deniable, completely off the books. If something goes wrong, we never existed and you never met us." "What's the mission?" "Someone's been trying to reconstitute Night Raven's assets without authorization. Either it's a sanctioned black project that's being kept secret from the wrong people, or it's something else entirely. Either way, we need to find out what's really going on before innocent people get hurt." "When do we start?" "We already have. Tomorrow night, you're going to take a little unauthorized flight with me. Hope you're not afraid of aircraft that don't officially exist." As she gathered her papers and stood to leave, Jake felt the familiar thrill of standing at the edge of something dangerous and unknown. But this time, the danger felt different, more personal, more immediate, and infinitely more important than anything he'd ever done before. "Phantom," he called as she reached the door. She turned back, and for just a moment he saw not the invisible supply clerk or even the dangerous operative, but something else, someone who'd carried the weight of protecting the world in silence for far too long. "Thanks for trusting me." "Don't thank me yet, Captain Morrison. You might not like where this trust leads us." The unauthorized flight was scheduled for 200 hours, when Nellie's Air Force Base would be at its quietest, and the skeleton crew of night shift personnel would be focused on routine maintenance rather than monitoring every aircraft movement. Jake Morrison had spent the day going through the motions of normal duty, while his mind raced with anticipation and a healthy dose of fear. At 1:30, he made his way to Hangar 7, a nondescript building on the far edge of the base that officially housed overflow equipment storage. But when he entered through the side door using the access code Steele had provided, he discovered that Hangar 7 was anything but nondescript. The aircraft waiting inside defied immediate classification. It was roughly F-22 sized, but the lines were subtly different, sleeker, more organic, as if the traditional Raptor design had been refined by someone who understood aerodynamics at a level beyond current military engineering. The stealth coating seemed to absorb light rather than simply deflecting it, giving the aircraft an almost spectral appearance in the hangar's dim illumination. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Raven's voice came from behind him, and he turned to see her approaching in a flight suit he'd never seen before, matte black with no visible insignia, except for a small raven embroidered in silver thread on the left breast. "What exactly am I looking at?" F-22X Ghost, tail number that doesn't exist, manufactured by a company that never built it, paid for with funds that were never allocated. She moved around the aircraft with the familiarity of long association, running her hands along surfaces that seemed to ripple slightly under her touch. She's been waiting 3 years for someone to take her flying again. And tonight that someone is us. Tonight that someone is me. You're just along for the ride. Raven gestured toward a second flight suit hanging nearby. That's yours. Hope you're not claustrophobic. The Ghost was designed for single-seat operations, but we've made some modifications. The modifications, Jake discovered as they prepared for flight, involved a tandem seating arrangement that put him directly behind Raven with access to secondary flight controls and instruments. The cockpit was a marvel of engineering, displays that seemed to float in midair, controls that responded to gesture as much as touch, and a heads-up display that provided more information than should have been possible to process simultaneously. "Where exactly are we going?" Jake asked as Raven ran through pre-flight procedures with practiced efficiency. "Coordinates that don't appear on any official chart, to investigate a facility that doesn't exist, using an aircraft that was never built." She looked back at him with that slight smile. "Try to keep up." The takeoff was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The Ghost didn't just leave the ground. It seemed to slip free of gravity's hold with an almost supernatural grace. Within minutes, they were at altitude, traveling at speeds that the instrument panel claimed were impossible, yet so smoothly that Jake felt like they were floating in still air. "How is this aircraft not in full production?" he asked through the intercom. "Because it represents technology that's about 20 years ahead of what the public thinks is possible. Put aircraft like this in general service, and within 5 years our enemies would reverse engineer the capabilities. Keep them restricted to special operations, and they remain our secret advantage." They flew in companionable silence for nearly an hour, crossing state lines at altitudes and speeds that would have been detected by conventional radar if the aircraft had been conventional. But apparently the Ghost's stealth capabilities were as advanced as everything else about it. They appeared to be completely invisible to ground-based detection systems. "Contact ahead," Raven announced, and Jake looked at his displays to see what appeared to be a facility in the middle of nowhere, showing heat signatures consistent with active operations. "Whatever's happening down there, it's happening right now." As they descended for a closer look, Jake began to understand why Steele Reynolds had been worried. The facility below was clearly military in nature, with hardened hangars, defensive positions, and what appeared to be an active runway. But more concerning were the aircraft he could see through his night vision systems, aircraft that looked disturbingly similar to the one they were flying. How many Ghost variants are there supposed to be? He asked. Officially, 3 prototypes all accounted for. Then, what are those 4 aircraft on the runway down there? Raven's voice, when she answered, carried a note of something Jake had never heard from her before. Uncertainty mixed with genuine concern. That, Captain Morrison, is exactly what we came here to find out. The facility below them was a hive of activity despite the late hour. Through the Ghost's advanced sensors, they could observe personnel moving between buildings, aircraft being prepared for flight, and what appeared to be a full-scale military operation in progress. But something about the operation felt wrong, too organized, too efficient, too familiar. Those personnel movements, Jake observed, studying the patterns on his display. They're using military protocols but not current ones. Those are formation patterns from about 10 years ago. Good eye. Raven banked the Ghost into a wide, silent circle around the perimeter of the facility. Someone's been doing their homework. The question is whether they learned those patterns from official sources or unofficial ones. As they completed their first orbit, more details became clear. The aircraft on the runway weren't perfect copies of the Ghost. They were close enough to fool casual observation, but Jake's trained eye could spot the differences. Slightly different wing configurations, what appeared to be different engine placements, subtle variations that suggested either reverse engineering or parallel development. Multiple possibilities, Raven said, as if reading his thoughts. Best case scenario. This is a legitimate black project that's been compartmentalized beyond our clearance level. Middle case. This is an enemy operation trying to duplicate Night Raven's capabilities. Worst case. This is what's left of the original Night Ravens, and they've gone rogue. Which one do you think it is? I'm hopping for best case and preparing for worst case. She adjusted their altitude, taking them higher and further from potential detection. But there's one way to find out for sure. Please tell me you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting. I'm suggesting we go down there and ask some pointed questions. But first, we need to know what we're walking into. Raven activated additional sensor packages, and suddenly Jake's displays were flooded with information. Heat signatures, communication intercepts, electromagnetic analysis, and what appeared to be real-time facial recognition on personnel visible in the facility's external areas. One of the faces made him freeze. That's impossible. What? That man by the hangar, the one in the flight suit. Jake enhanced the image, comparing it to files he'd memorized from Steele's briefing materials. According to the records, he died in a training accident 18 months ago. Raven was quiet for a long moment, studying the same image. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that Jake was beginning to recognize as the sound of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew. Vega, call sign Wildcard. He was the best pilot in the squadron and the most unstable. If he's alive and if he's here, then this isn't a coincidence or a parallel development. You think he stole the technology? I think someone helped him steal it. Vega was brilliant in the cockpit, but he couldn't organize something like this on his own. This level of operation requires serious funding, serious connections, and serious motivation. As if responding to her words, activity at the facility suddenly intensified. Aircraft engines began spinning up, personnel moved with increased urgency, and within minutes, 2 of the Ghost variants were taxiing toward the runway. They know we're here, Jake realized. Maybe, or maybe this is just unfortunate timing. But Raven was already adjusting their heading, putting distance between the Ghost and the facility below. Either way, we've seen enough for one night. The flight back to Nellie's was tense, with both pilots monitoring their instruments for any sign of pursuit. But the Ghost's stealth capabilities proved as advertised. If they were being followed, their pursuers were using detection methods that didn't register on conventional sensors. As they approached their home base, Jake found himself processing everything they'd observed. A rogue Night Ravens pilot, apparently alive despite official reports. Aircraft that shouldn't exist being operated by personnel using outdated military protocols. A facility conducting operations that were clearly significant but completely off the official radar. "What's our next move?" he asked as they began their approach to Hangar 7. "Our next move is to report what we found to Steele and let him decide how deep this rabbit hole goes. But Jake," she used his first name for the first time, and something in her tone made him pay attention. "Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than just one rogue pilot and some stolen technology. This feels like the beginning of something, not the end." As they touched down in the darkened hangar, Jake Morrison realized that his life had just become exponentially more complicated. But looking at the woman in the pilot's seat ahead of him, someone who'd spent years protecting a world that would never know her name, he found himself oddly grateful for the complication. Some fights, he was beginning to understand, were worth disappearing for. The debriefing with Steele Reynolds took place in the same abandoned gas station, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. The casual confidence of their previous meeting had been replaced by something harder, more urgent. Steele studied the reconnaissance photos and sensor data from their unauthorized flight with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle where the wrong answer might get people killed. "Vega," he said finally, setting down the enhanced facial recognition image. "I should have known. That boy was always too smart for his own good and too unstable for anyone else's." "You knew he was alive?" Raven asked. "I suspected. His death was convenient, training accident, closed casket, classified burial. But Vega was the kind of pilot who could walk away from crashes that should have been fatal. The question was whether he stayed dead by choice or by necessity." Jake studied the facility layout they'd captured. "This isn't the work of one person, even someone with Vega's capabilities. The infrastructure, the personnel, the aircraft, someone's been planning this for years." "And funding it," Raven added. "Those modifications to the Ghost variants, the facility construction, the personnel recruitment, we're talking about hundreds of millions in development costs. That's nation-state level financing." Steele walked to his communications array and began pulling up files that Jake hadn't seen before. 3 months after the Night Ravens were officially disbanded, certain classified technologies began appearing on international black markets. Nothing complete, nothing that would compromise operational security, but enough pieces to suggest someone was selling information. "Vega." "That was our assumption, but now I'm wondering if Vega wasn't the seller, if he was the buyer." Steele turned back to face them, his expression grim. What if someone approached him after his supposed death, offered him a chance to continue flying, continue the mission, but outside official channels? The implications of that possibility settled over the room like a cold fog. Jake found himself thinking about the personnel they'd observed at the facility. Too organized, too professional, too familiar with military protocols to be random mercenaries or foreign operatives. "Other Night Ravens?" he asked. "That's what I'm afraid of," Steele admitted. 8 pilots total in the original squadron. Phantom here, Vega supposedly dead, myself retired. That leaves 5 pilots who were scattered to regular assignments after disbandment. If someone convinced them that the official shutdown was a mistake, that the world still needed Night Raven's capabilities. "They might have gone freelance," Raven finished, "but working for whom?" Steele pulled up another file, this one showing financial transactions that appeared to trace back to shell companies and offshore accounts. "That's what we need to find out. Because if our former teammates are flying stolen aircraft for the highest bidder, the damage they could do is incalculable." Jake studied the financial data, noting patterns that seemed familiar from his intelligence training. These funding sources, they're sophisticated, but they're not random. Someone's being very careful to hide their identity, but they're also leaving breadcrumbs that suggest they want to be found by the right people. "A recruitment pitch," Raven said suddenly. "They're not trying to stay hidden. They're trying to attract attention from people with the right skill sets and security clearances. People like us." The conversation was interrupted by an alert from Steele's monitoring equipment. He moved quickly to his displays, pulling up what appeared to be intercepted communications traffic. Encrypted transmission, routed through multiple satellites, originating from the coordinates you surveilled last night. He frowned at the data. It's addressed to Nellie's Air Force Base, specifically to personnel files for Captain Morrison and a supply clerk named R. Blackthorne. Jake felt his blood run cold. They know who we are. They know we were there, Raven corrected, but her voice carried the same tension. The question is what they want to do about it. Steele continued analyzing the intercepted data. The transmission includes what appears to be a meeting request, coordinates, time, and a message that says simply, "Time to come home." "It's a trap," Jake said immediately. "Maybe, or maybe it's an invitation." Raven was studying the coordinates on Steele's display. "Those coordinates, I know that location. It's where we used to conduct final evaluations for Night Raven's candidates. If Vega and the others are really behind this, they're not just sending us a message. They're sending us a memory." Steele looked between them with an expression that mixed pride and concern. "So what's it going to be? Do we accept their invitation to walk into what could be an ambush, or do we try to solve this puzzle from the outside?" Jake thought about everything he'd learned in the past week, about shadow wars fought by invisible pilots, about missions that saved the world without anyone knowing they'd been in danger, about the kind of dedication it took to protect people who would never be able to thank you for it. Then he looked at Raven, sitting quietly but radiating the kind of controlled tension that came from years of making life-and-death decisions in impossible circumstances. "We go," he said finally, "but we go prepared and we go smart. If our former teammates have gone rogue, someone needs to stop them before they cause irreparable damage. If they're working for enemies of the United States, someone needs to bring them home. Either way, running from this problem won't make it go away." Raven nodded slowly. "The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow night. That gives us 24 hours to prepare for whatever we're walking into." "And if it is a trap?" Steele asked. "Then we spring it on our terms," she replied, and Jake heard in her voice the echo of someone who'd never lost a mission. "Because whatever else they might be now, they used to be Night Ravens, and Night Ravens never leave their wingmen behind." As they began planning for what could be their most dangerous mission yet, Jake Morrison realized that somewhere in the past week, he'd stopped thinking of himself as an observer of this shadow world. He'd become a participant in it, and there was no going back. The meeting coordinates led them to a location Jake recognized from his survival training, a box canyon in the Nevada desert that provided natural concealment from ground observation and limited approach routes that could be easily monitored. It was the kind of place you chose when you wanted to control every variable in a potentially hostile encounter. They arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting time, using the Ghost stealth capabilities to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the area. What they found confirmed Jake's suspicions about the tactical thinking behind the location choice: elevated positions that provided overlapping fields of fire, escape routes that could be covered by a single sniper, and natural choke points that would force any approaching force into predetermined kill zones. "Professional work," Raven observed as they completed their third orbit of the canyon. "Whoever planned this knows how to set up a meeting that could turn into an ambush at a moment's notice." "The question is whether they're planning to ambush us or protect themselves from someone else," Jake replied. "In our business, those often amount to the same thing." They selected a landing zone approximately 2 miles from the meeting coordinates, concealing the Ghost behind rock formations that would hide it from casual observation, while providing quick access if they needed to leave in a hurry. The approach to the meeting site would be on foot, across terrain that offered both cover and concealment, but also multiple opportunities for hidden observers to track their movement. Standard rules apply, Raven said as they checked their equipment. Trust nothing, assume everything, and be prepared to fight our way out if diplomacy fails. What about the possibility that these really are our former colleagues who have just chosen a different path? Then we give them a chance to explain themselves before we decide whether to arrest them or join them. The walk to the meeting site took 45 minutes across terrain that seemed designed to test their situational awareness. Jake found himself cataloging potential threats, escape routes, and defensive positions with the kind of automatic tactical thinking that came from years of training and months of combat experience. But this felt different, more personal, more consequential than any mission he'd flown in Syria or Iraq. The meeting site was exactly what the coordinates had indicated, a natural amphitheater formed by wind and water erosion, with walls high enough to provide acoustic privacy, but not so high as to prevent rapid egress. A single figure waited in the center of the space, silhouetted against the desert twilight. As they approached, Jake recognized him from the surveillance photographs, tall, lean, with the kind of precise movements that marked him as someone comfortable with violence. But there was something else in his posture, something that spoke of weariness rather than aggression. "Phantom," the figure called when they were close enough for conversation. "You look good. Civilian life apparently agrees with you." "Vega," Raven's voice carried no warmth but no hostility either. "You look alive, which is more than your official records indicate." "Death is highly overrated. I much prefer my current arrangement." He gestured for them to approach closer. "And you must be Captain Morrison. Your reputation precedes you. Steele always did know how to pick promising candidates." "What do you want, Vega?" Raven asked, getting directly to the point. "I want to offer you something you didn't know you were missing. Purpose. Real missions. The chance to make a difference without having to ask permission from politicians who wouldn't understand the necessity of what we do even if we could explain it to them. By stealing classified technology and setting up shop as freelance operators. By preserving capabilities that short-sighted bureaucrats were willing to throw away in the name of budget optimization." Vega's voice carried the passion of someone who genuinely believed in what he was saying. "Do you know what's happened in the 18 months since Night Ravens went dark? Mumbai nearly lost half its population to a biological weapon. Damascus was 6 hours away from a nuclear incident. A cartel in Mexico got their hands on military-grade drones and used them to kill 300 civilians. And you could have prevented all of that. We did prevent all of that, just not officially, not wearing the flag, not with the blessing of people who think national security is something you can schedule in quarterly budget meetings." Jake felt something shift in the conversation, a recognition that whatever else Vega might be, he wasn't a mercenary or a traitor in any conventional sense. He was a soldier who'd found a different way to fight the same war. "Who's funding this operation?" he asked. "People who understand that some problems require solutions that exist outside normal diplomatic and military channels. People who have watched the official system fail repeatedly and decided that maybe the problem isn't the missions, maybe the problem is the system." Raven took a step closer, and Jake could see her evaluating everything about Vega's posture, voice, and positioning. "What are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to come home, Phantom. To remember what it felt like to fly missions that mattered, to make decisions that saved lives, to be part of something larger than bureaucratic ass-covering and political theater." He looked at Jake. "And I'm offering Captain Morrison here the chance to be part of something that will make his Syria deployment look like a training exercise. And if we refuse, then you go back to Nellie's, and you pretend this conversation never happened, and you watch the world burn from the sidelines while politicians debate whether saving lives is cost-effective." Jake found himself genuinely torn. Everything about Vega's presentation suggested sincerity, competence, and a genuine commitment to protecting innocent lives. But everything about the situation screamed of complications that could destroy careers, lives, and potentially national security. "We need time to think about this," Raven said finally. "Of course you do, but don't think too long, Phantom. The world doesn't pause its problems while we debate solutions." As they walked away from the meeting site, Jake found himself wondering if they'd just been recruited by heroes or threatened by criminals. In his experience, the difference often depended entirely on perspective. The flight back to Nellie's was conducted in total silence, both pilots lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just experienced. Jake found himself replaying every word of the conversation with Vega, looking for tells that might indicate deception or manipulation, but coming up empty. Whatever else the man might be, he appeared to genuinely believe everything he'd said. It wasn't until they were back in Hangar 7, securing the Ghost for the night, that Raven finally spoke. "What's your read on him?" "Honest, committed, probably right about the threats he mentioned." Jake paused, considering his words carefully. "Also probably operating outside any oversight or accountability that would prevent him from causing as much damage as he prevents." "That's my assessment too, which leaves us with a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where every possible choice leads to consequences we might not be able to live with." Raven moved around the aircraft with her usual precision, but Jake could see the tension in her movements. "If we report this to official channels, Vega and his people disappear, taking with them capabilities that might be the only thing standing between civilization and some very serious threats. And if we don't report it, then we become accessories to whatever they're doing, whether it's heroic or criminal. And based on what we've seen so far, it might be both." They finished securing the aircraft and made their way out of the hangar into the desert night. The sky was clear, stars visible in a way that was impossible in more populated areas, and Jake found himself thinking about the vast expanse of threats and opportunities that existed beyond the reach of conventional military and diplomatic responses. "There's a third option," he said as they reached their vehicles. "I'm listening." "We join them. Not officially, not permanently, but close enough to find out what they're really doing and who they're really working for. If they're legitimate, we help them. If they're not, we stop them." Raven was quiet for a long moment, studying the stars with the kind of intensity she usually reserved for tactical situations. Finally, she looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's either the smartest suggestion you've made or the dumbest, possibly both. What do you think?" "I think Vega was right about one thing. The world doesn't pause its problems while we debate solutions, and I think we're not going to solve this puzzle from the outside. So we go undercover with a group of rogue pilots flying stolen aircraft for unknown benefactors, with no backup and no official support." "When you put it like that, it sounds insane." "It is insane. Good thing we're not particularly sane people." As they drove back to their quarters, Jake Morrison found himself wondering if this was how every night Raven's mission had begun, with rational people making irrational decisions, because the alternative was watching innocent people die. If so, he was beginning to understand why the program had been so effective, and why it had been so difficult for the military bureaucracy to manage. Some missions, he was learning, were too important to be left to people who worried about things like official authorization and career consequences. Some missions required people who were willing to disappear into the darkness, trusting that someone, somewhere, would remember that they'd been trying to do the right thing. Looking at the woman driving beside him, someone who'd spent years making those kinds of decisions, Jake realized that he was about to find out firsthand what that kind of dedication felt like. And despite the risks, despite the uncertainty, despite the very real possibility that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers, he found himself looking forward to it. The message from Vega arrived through encrypted channels exactly 24 hours after their meeting in the desert. Steele Reynolds decoded it in his makeshift command center, while Jake and Raven looked on, all three of them understanding that their response would determine everything that followed. Coordinates for a training facility, Steele read from his display. Instructions to arrive with minimal personal effects and maximum commitment, and a warning that this is a one-way door. Once we walk through it, there's no going back to our previous lives. Dramatic, Jake observed. Accurate, Raven corrected. If we do this, if we go undercover with Vega's operation, our official careers are over. Best case scenario, we're quietly retired with classified records. Worst case, we're court-martialed as traitors and spend the rest of our lives in federal prison. Steele closed the message and turned to face them directly. I've been thinking about this for the past day, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The threats Vega mentioned are real. I've seen the intelligence reports, the classified briefings, the after-action reviews of incidents that were contained by luck rather than planning. If there really is a group out there with Night Raven's capabilities working to address those threats, then maybe the question isn't whether we should join them. Maybe the question is whether we can afford not to. What about accountability? Jake asked. What about oversight and proper authorization? What about results? Steele countered. How many people are alive today because Phantom flew unauthorized missions in unauthorized aircraft against unauthorized targets? How many cities still exist because someone was willing to act without waiting for permission? The weight of that question settled over the room like desert dust. Jake thought about his deployment to Syria, about all the times when mysterious equipment failures had saved his life, when enemy fighters had vanished from radar at critical moments, when convoy routes had been inexplicably clear of threats. He'd attributed it to good intelligence and tactical superiority, but now he understood it had been something else entirely. Guardian angels flying aircraft that didn't exist, protecting people who would never know they'd been in danger. If we do this, Raven said quietly, we need to establish some ground rules. No matter what Vega's operation involves, no matter who's funding it, we're still bound by certain principles. We don't target innocent civilians. We don't work for enemies of the United States. We don't compromise national security for personal gain. And if we discover that Vega's people have already crossed those lines, then we stop them, whatever it takes. Steele nodded slowly. I can live with those parameters. The question is whether Vega and his backers can live with them too. They spent the next hour discussing operational security, communication protocols, and contingency plans for various scenarios ranging from successful infiltration to complete mission failure. By the time they finished, Jake felt as prepared as anyone could be for a mission that was, by definition, improvised and unprecedented. One last thing, Steele said as they prepared to leave. If this goes sideways, if you find yourselves in a situation where you need extraction or support, remember that there are still people in official positions who remember what Night Ravens accomplished. The program might be disbanded, but the relationships and loyalties remain. Are you saying we'll have unofficial backup? I'm saying that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and sometimes the most important missions are the ones that never appear in any official record. As they walked out of the abandoned gas station for what might be the last time, Jake Morrison found himself thinking about legacy, about the difference between the missions that made headlines and the missions that made history, about the pilots who flew into danger so that other people could sleep safely, never knowing how close they'd come to disaster. 3 days later, they found themselves driving through the desert toward coordinates that led to what appeared to be another abandoned facility. But as they approached the specified location, Jake began to see signs that suggested this abandonment was carefully orchestrated. 2 clean buildings, equipment that looked unused rather than deteriorated, defensive positions that were empty but recently maintained. "Welcome to your new home," Vega said, emerging from what had appeared to be an empty guard shack. "Hope you're ready to remember what real flying feels like." As they followed him into the facility, Jake caught sight of aircraft that made the Ghost look conventional by comparison. Sleek, organic shapes that seemed to bend light around them, propulsion systems that operated in near-perfect silence, weapons systems that appeared to integrate seamlessly with the aircraft's structure. "Impressive," Raven said, and Jake could hear genuine admiration in her voice. "Impressive is just the beginning," Vega replied. "Wait until you see what they can do." Looking around at the facility, at the aircraft, at the personnel moving with the kind of professional competence that marked them as elite operators, Jake Morrison realized that he just crossed a threshold into a world that existed in the spaces between official policy and practical necessity. A world where the missions were always critical, the stakes were always high, and the operators were always expendable. It was exactly where he wanted to be. The orientation process was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his military career. No paperwork, no official briefings, no lengthy security clearances or background investigations. Instead, Vega led them through the facility with the casual efficiency of someone giving a tour of his personal workshop. 18 aircraft total, he explained as they walked through a hangar that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of architectural possibility. Each one represents technology that's approximately 15 years ahead of anything in conventional military service. Range, speed, stealth, weapons systems. Everything you thought you knew about air superiority is about to become obsolete. Jake studied the aircraft with growing amazement. The designs varied considerably. Some appeared optimized for air-to-air combat, others for ground attack, still others for reconnaissance and surveillance. But they all shared certain characteristics: the light-bending stealth coating, the whisper-quiet propulsion systems, and what appeared to be modular weapons systems that could be reconfigured for specific mission requirements. "Where did all this come from?" Raven asked. "Various sources. Some of it represents natural evolution of Night Raven's technology. Some represents parallel development by other programs. Some represents technology that was deemed too advanced for official deployment." Vega stopped beside an aircraft that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood aerodynamics at a fundamentally different level than conventional engineers. "And some represents innovations that were developed right here, by people who were tired of waiting for bureaucrats to approve solutions to urgent problems. And the funding for all this development comes from people who understand that national security isn't limited to threats that can be addressed through conventional diplomatic and military channels." Vega's tone carried a note of pride mixed with defensiveness. Private citizens, former government officials, corporate leaders who have seen classified threat assessments and decided that someone needs to do something about them. They continued the tour, observing training facilities, maintenance bays, briefing rooms, and living quarters that suggested this was designed as a fully self-contained operation. The personnel they encountered were professional, competent, and notably diverse. Not just former military pilots, but engineers, intelligence analysts, weapons specialists, and support personnel who appeared to have been recruited from across the spectrum of national security organizations. "How many people know about this place?" Jake asked. "Need-to-know basis. Probably 50 people have complete operational knowledge, maybe 200 have partial knowledge, and perhaps 1,000 people worldwide are involved in various aspects of funding, logistics, and political protection." Political protection. "You don't think an operation like this could exist without some level of official tolerance, do you?" Vega smiled at Jake's expression. "We're not completely rogue, Captain Morrison. We're just operating under authorities and oversight mechanisms that don't appear in any public documentation." As the tour concluded, they were introduced to the other members of what Vega called the operational cadre, pilots and support personnel who would be working directly with them on mission planning and execution. Jake recognized several faces from the classified Night Raven's files, but there were others he didn't recognize. People who'd apparently been recruited from other special operations programs or from civilian backgrounds. Training begins tomorrow, Vega announced as they reached what appeared to be their assigned quarters. 6 weeks of intensive preparation covering everything from advanced aircraft systems to operational security to mission planning for scenarios that don't exist in any official playbook. And then we find out if you're really ready to fly missions that matter. That evening, as Jake settled into quarters that were surprisingly comfortable for a facility that officially didn't exist, he found himself reviewing everything they'd learned. The operation was larger, more sophisticated, and more professionally organized than he'd expected. The technology was genuinely advanced, the personnel were clearly competent, and the stated mission of addressing threats that fell through the cracks of official response seemed legitimate. But questions remained. Who exactly was providing the funding? What oversight mechanisms existed to prevent mission creep or abuse of capabilities? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen to people who decided they wanted out of the program? A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Raven, who entered without waiting for invitation and settled into the room's single chair with the kind of casual alertness that had become familiar. "Thoughts?" she asked. "Impressive operation, professional people, legitimate concerns about real threats." Jake sat on the edge of his narrow bed. Also, no clear exit strategy and no obvious accountability mechanisms. "My assessment too, which means we're committed to seeing this through, at least long enough to understand what we've gotten ourselves into." "Any regrets?" Raven was quiet for a moment, looking out the small window at the desert landscape beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. "I regret a lot of things, Jake. I regret missions that went wrong, people who got hurt, opportunities to make a difference that were lost to bureaucratic inertia. But I don't regret being willing to step outside official channels when official channels proved inadequate. Even if it means our careers are over. Careers end. Lives matter. If we can save lives by sacrificing careers, that seems like a reasonable trade-off." As she left to return to her own quarters, Jake found himself thinking about the nature of service, about the difference between serving institutions and serving principles, about the pilots who disappeared into shadow wars, protecting people who would never know their names, making sacrifices that would never appear in any official record. Outside his window, the desert stars provided the only illumination in a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there, threats existed that conventional military and diplomatic responses couldn't address. And now, whether by choice or by necessity, he was part of the solution. It was, he realized, exactly what he'd been preparing for his entire career without knowing it. The training regimen was unlike anything Jake had experienced, even in his most intensive military programs. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, covering everything from advanced aircraft systems to unconventional warfare tactics to psychological preparation for operations that would never receive official recognition. The aircraft systems training alone was revelatory. The technological capabilities built into each aircraft were staggering. Radar systems that could track targets at ranges previously thought impossible, electronic warfare suites that could disable enemy systems without firing a shot, weapons systems that could engage multiple targets simultaneously with precision that bordered on the supernatural. "Forget everything you think you know about air-to-air combat," instructed their primary flight instructor, a former Navy pilot called Ghost, whose real name was apparently classified even within this organization. "These aircraft don't fight like conventional fighters. They don't need to. When you can see your enemy before he knows you exist, when you can disable his systems before he can react, When you can engage from ranges where return fire is impossible, traditional dogfighting becomes irrelevant. But the technology was only part of the preparation. Equal time was spent on mission planning for scenarios that seemed borrowed from thriller novels, preventing nuclear materials from reaching terrorist cells, stopping biological weapons before they could be deployed, intercepting intelligence that could prevent wars before they started. The missions we fly don't exist in any official capacity, Vega explained during one of their strategic briefings, which means the rules of engagement are entirely situational. No congressional authorization, no UN resolutions, no diplomatic protests if things go wrong. Just results, and the understanding that failure isn't an option because there's no backup plan. Jake found the moral complexity of the training both fascinating and disturbing. On one hand, the scenarios they studied were clearly designed to prevent massive loss of life and protect national security interests. On the other hand, the methods they were being trained to employ operated completely outside any framework of official oversight or legal accountability. "How do we know we're the good guys?" he asked Raven during one of their brief rest periods. "We don't," she replied with characteristic directness. "We can only judge based on results and intentions. If the missions we fly save lives and protect innocent people, if the threats we neutralize were real and imminent, then we're probably on the right side. If not, we become the kind of people we used to fight against." Exactly, which is why it's important to maintain our own standards, regardless of what anyone else tells us is acceptable. 3 weeks into training, they were introduced to what Vega called the real-world application phase. Instead of simulated scenarios, they began flying actual missions, reconnaissance flights over areas of concern, intelligence-gathering operations, and what appeared to be preventive strikes against targets that posed imminent threats to civilian populations. Their first mission took them to a location in Central Asia, where intelligence suggested a terrorist cell was preparing to deploy chemical weapons against a refugee camp. The flight took 8 hours each way, operating at altitudes and speeds that should have been impossible for aircraft of conventional design, using stealth technology that rendered them completely invisible to ground-based detection systems. The mission itself was almost anticlimactic. By the time they arrived at the target coordinates, the terrorist cell was in the final stages of preparing their attack. Jake and Raven, flying as a two-ship formation, were able to disable the chemical weapons with precision strikes that neutralized the threat without causing casualties among the civilian population in the area. 12,000 people in that refugee camp, Vega informed them during their post-mission debrief. They'll never know how close they came to dying, and they'll never know who saved them. But they'll go to sleep tonight instead of dying in agony, and that's what matters. Jake found himself profoundly affected by the mission. The technology had worked flawlessly, the intelligence had been accurate, and the threat had been real and imminent. By any reasonable standard, they'd accomplished something genuinely heroic. But the fact that it had been done completely outside official channels, without any oversight or authorization, left him feeling unsettled. "Does it get easier?" he asked Raven as they prepared for sleep after the long mission. "The flying gets easier, the technology becomes familiar, the tactical problems become routine." She paused, looking out at the desert landscape that surrounded their facility. "But the moral complexity never goes away. Every mission requires you to decide, personally and individually, whether what you're doing is right. Nobody else can make that decision for you. And if you decide wrong, then you live with the consequences, or you don't live at all." As Jake settled into his bunk that night, he found himself thinking about the 12,000 people in that refugee camp who would never know they'd been saved, about the terrorist cell that would never know why their weapons had suddenly stopped working, about the invisible war being fought by invisible soldiers, protecting a world that would never be able to thank them for their service. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of mission he joined the military to fly. The fact that it was no longer officially military didn't make it any less important. Outside his window, the stars provided the only light in a landscape that stretched endlessly toward horizons he couldn't see. And somewhere beyond those horizons, other threats were developing that would require other solutions. Solutions that might depend on people like him being willing to disappear into the darkness, trusting that someone, somewhere, would remember that they'd been trying to do the right thing. The second month of training focused on what Vega called deep operational integration, learning to work seamlessly with intelligence networks, support personnel, and command structures that existed in the spaces between official organizations. Jake began to understand that the aircraft and weapons systems were only the most visible part of a much larger infrastructure. Intelligence comes from everywhere, explained their briefing officer, a former CIA analyst known only as Oracle. Official channels, unofficial sources, private contractors, foreign allies who can't admit they're sharing information, academic researchers who don't know their work has intelligence applications. Our job is to synthesize all of that into actionable intelligence that can prevent problems before they become crises. The scope of the intelligence network was staggering. Real-time satellite feeds from multiple national and commercial sources, human intelligence from operatives scattered across 6 continents, signals intelligence from communication intercepts that would have been impressive for official government agencies. All of it flowing into analysis centers that produced mission briefs with turnaround times measured in hours rather than days or weeks. Speed matters, Oracle continued. The threats we address don't wait for bureaucratic approval processes. A nuclear weapon moves from secure storage to terrorist hands in 72 hours. A biological agent spreads from containment failure to pandemic potential in 48 hours. Chemical weapons can be deployed against civilian populations in 12 hours. If we can't respond faster than the threats develop, people die. Their third mission came with only 6 hours of advance notice. Intelligence indicated that a cargo ship carrying radioactive materials had been seized by pirates off the coast of Somalia, with indications that the pirates intended to sell the materials to buyers who would use them for radiological weapons. Conventional military response would have required days of planning, diplomatic clearances, and coordination between multiple international agencies. By the time official responses could be implemented, the materials would have disappeared into black market networks. Jake and Raven launched from their base in Nevada and arrived over the target area 8 hours later, having been refueled twice by aircraft that appeared on no official flight plans and operated from bases that existed only as coordinates in classified navigation systems. The mission required precision flying at extremely low altitude, using the advanced aircraft's stealth capabilities to approach the hijacked ship without being detected by either the pirates or the international naval forces operating in the area. Visual confirmation of radioactive materials, Raven reported through their encrypted communication system. Multiple containers appears to be hospital-grade cesium sources. Copy that, Phantom. Recommend immediate neutralization of threat. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Using weapons systems that could disable electronic equipment without causing explosions, they rendered the pirate vessel completely inoperable while leaving the crew and cargo unharmed. Within hours, international naval forces had boarded the vessel and secured the radioactive materials, never knowing that the pirates' sudden inability to maneuver or communicate had been caused by intervention from aircraft that officially didn't exist. Another successful mission that never happened, Vega observed during their debrief. The radioactive materials are secure, the pirates are in custody, and the potential for radiological terrorism has been eliminated. The international naval forces get credit for a successful boarding operation, and we get the satisfaction of knowing we prevented thousands of potential casualties. but Jake was beginning to notice patterns in their missions that concerned him. Each operation was successful, each threat was real, and each intervention prevented genuine harm to innocent people. But the intelligence that guided their missions seemed remarkably convenient, arriving at exactly the right time, with exactly the right level of detail, enabling exactly the kind of rapid response that justified the existence of their organization. "Do you ever wonder if we're being manipulated?" he asked Raven after their fourth mission, another precision strike against weapons smugglers who'd been operating just beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. "Every day," she replied without hesitation. "The question is whether being manipulated into doing good work is better or worse than not doing the work at all. That's a disturbing way to look at it." "Everything about this is disturbing, Jake. We're operating outside any legal framework, using technology that doesn't officially exist, taking orders from people whose identities we don't know, funded by organizations we can't identify. The only thing that makes it tolerable is that the missions appear to be legitimate and the results appear to be saving lives. And if we discover that appearance is deceiving, then we stop, whatever the cost." Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from the communications center. "New mission, high priority, immediate deployment required." As they made their way to the briefing room, Jake found himself wondering if every night Raven's mission had felt this way, walking the line between heroism and criminality, trusting that someone, somewhere, was ensuring that their extraordinary capabilities were being used for extraordinary good rather than extraordinary harm. The briefing for their fifth mission was different from the others. Instead of Oracle providing intelligence analysis, Vega himself conducted the briefing, with a level of personal intensity that suggested this.